For years, those discharges out of Lake Okeechobee have poisoned our beaches, killed fish, and cost Florida millions in lost tourism.
But let's take a closer look at the green, blue algae and the colors on this satellite. They represent different levels of algae on the lake. If we could pull that up.
Footage from Lake Okeechobee has revealed something emerging that no one expected. NOAA satellites caught it on a routine pass. Two ink-black shapes bleeding out of the largest freshwater lake in Florida. One pushing east toward the Atlantic, one west toward the Gulf. Both visible from orbit. Within days, beach water turned the color of strong coffee. Health advisories went up on both coasts and have not been lifted. The strangest part is what biologists pulled out of those plumes in the lab. Whatever was rising had sat at the bottom for 70 years. It was never supposed to surface.
Lake Okeechobee is a vital part of Florida's ecosystem.
The biggest lake no one sees. Lake Okeechobee is the largest freshwater lake in the state of Florida. It covers 730 square miles. It is the second largest freshwater lake entirely contained within the lower 48 United States. From the southern shore, you cannot see the northern horizon, only sky and water, and the slow-moving haze of Florida heat. The Calusa called it Miami. The Spanish called it Laguna del Espiritu Santo. The Seminoles called it Okeechobee, which means big water. The name stuck. Here is the deal. For more than a century, this lake has been the beating heart of South Florida's water system. It feeds the Everglades. It supports the agricultural economy of Central Florida. It supplies drinking water to over 8 million people. It is connected by a series of man-made canals to both the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast and the Gulf of Mexico on the west. When something goes wrong at Lake Okeechobee, it does not stay at Lake Okeechobee. It goes everywhere. In December 2024, the South Florida Water Management District made what was supposed to be a routine decision. The lake's water level was running high. The Army Corps of Engineers, which has managed the lake's outflows since the 1930s, ordered a controlled release, several inches drawn down over a period of weeks. The goal was to protect the aging Herbert Hoover Dike and to restore the submerged grass beds. It had been done dozens of times before. Within 48 hours of the release beginning, the imagery coming down from NOAA's satellite passes stopped that operation cold. Massive plumes of black, oxygen-depleted water were spreading down the St. Lucie River toward the Atlantic and down the Caloosahatchee River toward the Gulf. The plumes were visible from orbit. They reached the coastlines within days. They turned beach water from blue to the color of strong coffee. Some now call Lake Okeechobee the dirtiest lake in America. Local biologists rushed to take samples. Tourism officials called emergency meetings. State environmental agencies issued health advisories that they have not yet rescinded as of this recording. And what the testing eventually revealed about what was actually inside that black water, what had been sitting at the bottom of the lake, waiting for exactly the wrong management decision to mobilize it, is the reason this single incident has quietly become one of the most consequential environmental events in modern American history. Because what happened at Okeechobee is not just a Florida problem, it is a preview. The wall they built around big water. To understand what those satellites were looking at, you first need to understand why Lake Okeechobee has a wall around it and what that wall was built to contain. The lake is shallow, remarkably shallow for its size. The average depth is only about 9 feet. In some places, you can wade hundreds of yards from shore before the water reaches your waist. That shallowness made the lake extraordinarily dangerous during storms. On September 16, 1928, a Category 5 hurricane made landfall near Palm Beach, Florida. The storm had already devastated Puerto Rico and the Bahamas. When it reached Florida, it carried sustained winds of 145 miles per hour directly over Lake Okeechobee. The lake had no containment system at the time. It was surrounded by low-lying agricultural land, much of it occupied by black migrant workers harvesting beans, sugarcane, and winter vegetables in the rich muck soil of the Everglades. The hurricane's winds pushed the lake's waters against the southern shore. The natural banks collapsed. A wall of water swept across the farmland. The official death toll was 2,500. The actual number was almost certainly higher, possibly over 3,000. Most of the victims were black agricultural workers whose deaths were never formally recorded. Mass graves were dug. Bodies were burned. At the time, it was the second deadliest natural disaster in American history. It was entirely preventable. In the aftermath, the federal government ordered a containment system. The Army Corps of Engineers began work on the Herbert Hoover Dike, a 143-mile earthen levee that would completely encircle Lake Okeechobee, transforming a natural lake into a controlled reservoir. By the 1960s, the lake was fully contained. Water could no longer escape over the natural banks. It could only leave through controlled outlets, canals, and spillways managed by the Corps according to strict operational schedules. The lake that had killed thousands was now under human control. That is what everyone believed, and that belief is exactly why nobody was ready for what those satellites would eventually catch on tape. 7 decades of runoff. Here is the catch. Containment created a new problem. The lake became a sink. Before the dike, the lake's waters had flowed naturally southward into the Everglades, filtering through marshlands that cleaned and dispersed the water over hundreds of miles, a slow-moving river of grass that stretched from central Florida to Florida Bay. That system had existed for thousands of years. The dike cut it off. The Everglades were drained for agriculture. The land between the lake and the remaining wetlands was converted into the Everglades agricultural area. Hundreds of thousands of acres of sugarcane, vegetables, and cattle ranches. This belt became one of the most productive farming regions in the country. Florida's year-round growing season and the rich muck soil supported an industry worth billions annually. The sugar industry alone became a political and economic powerhouse, dominating Florida agriculture and wielding enormous influence in state and federal politics. But farming at this scale requires fertilizer, and fertilizer contains phosphorus. Across 7 decades, the agricultural runoff from the Everglades agricultural area flowed into Lake Okeechobee. Phosphorus, essential for plant growth and devastating in excess, accumulated in the lake's waters and then in its sediments. The shallow lake acted as a settling pond. The phosphorus-laden particles sank to the bottom and stayed there. By the 1990s, scientists were warning that the lake contained a massive reservoir of legacy phosphorus. 3 generations of agricultural runoff stored in the bottom mud, waiting to be released if conditions changed. The conditions changed. The east or west choice Lake Okeechobee cannot overflow its banks. The Herbert Hoover Dike prevents that. But the lake must be managed within a narrow range of water levels. Too high, and the aging dike is at risk of failure. Too low, and the lake's ecology collapses. When the lake rises above safe levels, the Army Corps of Engineers has only 2 options. They can release water east through the St. Lucie Canal to the Atlantic, or release it west through the Caloosahatchee River to the Gulf of Mexico. These are the east or west choices, and here is the part nobody likes to admit. Both options are ecological disasters. The St. Lucie River flows through Martin and St. Lucie counties on Florida's Treasure Coast, eventually emptying into the Indian River Lagoon, one of the most biodiverse estuaries in North America. The lagoon supports over 4,000 species of plants and animals: manatees, dolphins, sea turtles, countless species of fish and birds. It is not designed to receive massive pulses of fresh water from a eutrophic lake. When Okeechobee water is released eastward, it floods the estuary with fresh water and disrupts the salinity balance that marine and brackish species depend on. Worse, it carries the nutrients, the phosphorus and nitrogen that fuel explosive algal growth. The result is algal blooms, including toxic cyanobacteria that produce compounds dangerous to humans and animals. Green slime coats the surface. Fish kills number in the millions. Manatees starve as the seagrass beds they depend on are smothered by algae and die. The 2016 algae bloom on the Treasure Coast was one of the worst environmental disasters in Florida history. Governor Rick Scott declared a state of emergency. Beaches were closed. Tourism cratered. Property values along the St. Lucie River collapsed. Drone shots from that summer showed entire neighborhoods backed by canals running the color of split pea soup. The Caloosahatchee River on the west coast carries its own version of the same curse. Releases toward the Gulf feed red tide events, a different type of algal bloom caused by Carenia brevis, which produces neurotoxins that kill fish by the millions and cause respiratory problems in people who breathe the air near affected beaches. The 2018 red tide event killed over 2,000 tons of marine life along Florida's Gulf Coast. Dead fish, manatees, dolphins, and sea turtles washed up on beaches from Naples to Tampa Bay. The stench was overwhelming. Local news crews ran beach footage on a loop for weeks. The tourism industry lost hundreds of millions of dollars. Both coasts have been held hostage to Lake Okeechobee's management for decades. The district says there have been over 75 Everglades Restoration Project milestones since 2019. But the December 2024 event was different. If you have made it this far and you are still with me, hit the subscribe button. We dig into stories like this one, buried environmental disasters, the decisions that triggered them, and the science nobody wanted to admit to in time. Subscribing tells the algorithm to keep showing you these breakdowns, and it is the only way I know to keep telling these stories. Now, back to December 2024, because what they pulled up from the bottom of Big Water was not what anyone expected. By the book. The release that began in December 2024 was planned according to the Army Corps' standard procedures, governed by the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. Several inches drawn down over weeks, a modest rate, timed to avoid peak tourist season, coordinated with state environmental agencies. Ben Marlowe, a senior hydrologist with the Army Corps' Jacksonville district, would later describe the early hours of the operation in a single line that has been quoted around the agency ever since. "We followed the manual. The manual is what failed." Because what the manual did not account for was what was sitting at the bottom of the lake. Moving large volumes of water creates turbulence. Currents form. Sediments that have been undisturbed for years can be stirred up off the bottom. Under normal conditions, the disturbance is minor. Slightly cloudier water, briefly elevated nutrients, nothing catastrophic. But Okeechobee sediments are not normal sediments. They contain phosphorus concentrations among the highest ever recorded in a natural water body. They contain dead algae, decomposed plant material, and organic waste accumulated since the Eisenhower administration. The release tugged at all of it. And then the satellites started seeing things they were not supposed to see. The black water at NOAA's National Environmental Satellite Service in Silver Spring, Maryland, Daniel Reyes, a senior imagery analyst on the regional desk, was the first person to put eyes on what was happening. By mid-morning on the second day of the release, 2 analysts from his team were leaning over his shoulder, comparing the Sentinel-2 imagery to the morning's Landsat pass. The plumes were not just visible. They were the dominant feature of the entire South Florida frame. Both rivers, the St. Lucie and the Caloosahatchee, were running dark from the lake to the coast. Reyes would later tell colleagues that he had never, in 11 years on the job, seen a freshwater system go that color in a single satellite cycle. The desk pulled in the regional office pulled in the state. By noon, the imagery had been forwarded to the South Florida Water Management District in West Palm Beach, where the morning meeting was already in progress. What he was watching was the lake bottom losing its memory. It was the most damage to Lake Okeechobee since Hurricane Wilma in 2005. The disturbance had been more severe than the models predicted. The sediments did not just stir slightly, they mobilized. Clouds of legacy muck rose into the water column and mixed with the water being pushed through the canals. As that muck-laden water moved downstream, the organic matter in it began to decompose. Decomposition consumes oxygen. When large quantities of organic matter decompose rapidly in water, the dissolved oxygen drops to levels that kill fish and other aquatic life. This is hypoxia. In the worst cases, anoxia, no oxygen at all. The water leaving Lake Okeechobee in December 2024 became hypoxic within hours, and it carried something else with it. Tannins, the same organic compounds that give tea its color. When massive quantities of decomposing plant matter release tannins into water, the water turns dark, brown, then black. Black water, visible from orbit, spreading like ink through the waterways. When environmental scientists finally got their analyses back, they found exactly what they feared. Phosphorus levels were off the charts, not the elevated levels typical of Okeechobee releases, concentrations that exceeded anything previously recorded during a release event. Dissolved oxygen was nearly zero in some samples. The water was functionally dead. Fish swimming into these plumes would suffocate within minutes. and the bacterial counts told the rest of the story. The phosphorus was fertilizer. Once the plumes hit the estuaries, that fertilizer would feed algal growth on a massive scale for months. 3 generations of buried agricultural runoff were now being delivered in concentrated form to the coastal ecosystems of both Florida coasts. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection issued health advisories for water contact along both the Treasure Coast and the Lee County coast. Swimming was discouraged, fishing was warned against, residents were told to stay away from affected waterways. Those advisories remain in effect, and the people who lived there were about to find out what black water actually feels like. What it looked like from the docks on the 3rd morning of the release. Dr. Marisol Vega, a senior estuary biologist with the Florida Oceanographic Society in Stuart, walks down to the public boardwalk on the St. Lucie River with a sample kit and a phone camera. The river is the color of dark chocolate. The smell hits her before she reaches the railing. Wet earth and something metallic underneath it. Mullet are floating belly up against the pilings, 6 and 8 at a time. A blue heron stands on a piece of driftwood a few feet away, refusing to step into the water. She takes a video that she would later describe to a local reporter as the worst single morning she has had in 17 years of field work. She does not finish the video. She is crying halfway through. Upstream, the Indian River Lagoon was already on the edge. The lagoon had spent years in slow recovery from the 2016 bloom. Researchers had been watching seagrass beds claw back acreage foot by foot. Then the December 2024 plume arrived. The water turned opaque. Sunlight could not penetrate. Photosynthesis stopped. The grass began to die. Manatees in the Indian River Lagoon had already been dying in record numbers. Over 1,100 manatees died in Florida in 2021 alone, most from starvation after seagrass die-offs. The December 2024 event threatened to trigger another mass mortality. On the west coast, the Caloosahatchee carried the same payload toward the Gulf. The plumes spread into San Carlos Bay and the waters around Sanibel and Captiva. Drone footage from local TV stations showed it pushing past the channel markers like a brown bruise across the bay. Wendell Hoy has run a small charter operation out of Bokeelia Marina on Pine Island for 31 years. The morning the plume reached his side of the bay, he walked out onto his dock and stood there for a long time without saying anything to his deckhand. The water around the pilings had gone the color of weak coffee, and a film he could not name was riding on the surface, catching the light wrong. He would later describe it to a Lee County reporter as a smell he had only smelled once before, after the 2018 red tide. Like the bay was rotting from the inside, he said. By the end of the week, he had canceled every charter on his books for the next 2 months. Red tide had been hovering at low background levels along the Gulf Coast. The nutrient pulse from Okeechobee was exactly the fuel Karenia brevis needed to bloom explosively. Within weeks, red tide concentrations were spiking along the Lee County coast. Dead fish were washing up on beaches. Residents and tourists were reporting respiratory irritation. A tourism industry that had only just clawed back from the 2018 event took another devastating blow. The economic damage cascaded outward. Fishing guides canceled charters. Hotels reported cancellations. Restaurants that depended on local seafood faced supply disruptions. Real. Estate agents watched waterfront property values wobble. The exact toll is still being calculated, but previous events provide context. The 2018 red tide caused an estimated $184 million in losses in Lee County alone. The 2016 algal bloom on the Treasure Coast caused similar damage. The December 2024 event affected both coasts at once, and the part nobody on either coast wants to say out loud is that none of this is being cleaned up. None of it is being reversed. The black water is still draining out of the lake. And the question that Vega and Hoy and Reyes are all asking in their separate corners of the state is the same question. No way out. Can this be fixed? The honest answer is probably not. If this lake dies, all the communities around it are going to suffer and go into a deep depression. The phosphorus that accumulated in Lake Okeechobee's sediments since before color television cannot be removed. There is no practical technology for extracting legacy nutrients from lake bottom muck at this scale. The contamination is permanent. The only options are management strategies that minimize disturbance. Keep the lake at stable levels. Avoid operations that create turbulence near the bottom. Except that certain management actions are now off the table because the consequences are too severe. But here is where it gets strange. Those strategies are in direct conflict with everything else the system has to do. The Herbert Hoover Dike is aging. Sections of the 143-mile levee are at risk of failure during major storms. Rehabilitation work has been ongoing for years. When lake levels rise, the dike is stressed. Releases become necessary for safety. Climate change is intensifying Florida's rainfall patterns. Wet seasons are getting wetter. Hurricanes are getting more intense. The frequency of high water events at Lake Okeechobee is climbing. And 8 million people still depend on the lake for drinking water. Agriculture still depends on it for irrigation. The competing demands are not going away. Keep the lake high, the dike is at risk. Lower the lake, legacy pollution is released. Send water south to the Everglades, the remaining wetlands receive nutrient-laden water that damages their ecology. Send water to the coasts, the estuaries collapse. Every option is bad. The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, CERP, was supposed to break this trap. Authorized in 2000, CERP is a more than $10 billion federal-state partnership designed to restore natural water flow through South Florida. Reservoirs, treatment marshes, modified water management practices, all aimed at reducing harmful discharges from Lake Okeechobee while restoring the Everglades. But CERP is decades behind schedule. Political opposition, funding shortfalls, and bureaucratic delays have slowed it to a crawl. The reservoirs that were supposed to store excess Okeechobee water and treat it before release are still in planning or early construction. The December 2024 event happened in the gap. The legacy infrastructure could not handle it. The restoration infrastructure does not exist yet, and the lake is not waiting. The legacy phosphorus is still in the sediments. The next time water managers need to lower the lake, the next hurricane season, the next wet winter, the next dike emergency, the same dynamics will play out. Turbulence will disturb the bottom. Legacy pollution will mobilize. Black water will flow toward the coasts. Lake Okeechobee is not unique. Across the country, lakes and reservoirs that have served as agricultural sinks for generations are sitting on the same buried inventory. The Great Lakes carry a century of industrial and agricultural legacy pollution. Chesapeake Bay struggles with nutrient runoff that has created dead zones for decades. The Mississippi River drains agricultural pollution from the entire Midwest into the Gulf, where a hypoxic zone the size of New Jersey reappears every summer. Warming water holds less oxygen. More intense rainfall mobilizes sediments more aggressively. What happened at Okeechobee in December 2024 is a preview of what other systems will face in the coming decades. The lesson is uncomfortable. We cannot undo what was done to these waterways over the past century. The pollution is in the sediments. The contamination is permanent. The best we can do is manage around it. And management has limits. The December 2024 event revealed those limits in stark terms. A routine operation, something that had been done dozens of times before, triggered an environmental catastrophe visible from space. Both Florida coasts contaminated at once. Health advisories still in effect. There is no fix. There is only management, and management just failed spectacularly. Lake Okeechobee, Big Water, has been the beating heart of South Florida for centuries. The Calusa fished its waters. The Seminoles navigated its marshes. The agricultural industry built an empire on its shores. Now it is a reservoir of buried poison accumulated since before the dike was finished, waiting for the next disturbance to release it toward both coasts. The wall we built around it after the 1928 hurricane was supposed to make the lake safe. It made the lake a trap instead. Everything that flowed in stayed in. The phosphorus, the nitrogen, the organic waste, all of it settled to the bottom and waited. In December 2024, we disturbed the sediments. What came out was 3 generations of accumulated damage compressed into a single event, spread across 2 coastlines, visible from orbit. Both Florida coasts are now contaminated. The Indian River Lagoon is dying. The Gulf Coast is battling another red tide. And Lake Okeechobee sits in the center, still full of legacy poison, still connected to 8 million people's drinking water. Still the only place the Army Corps can send excess water when the rains come and the dike needs protection. What happens next, this hurricane season, next winter, the decade after that, will determine whether South Florida can continue to function as a place where millions of people live, work, and depend on water that flows through a system that was broken before any of them were born. The December 2024 event was a warning. The question is whether anyone will heed it before the next event makes the warning look minor. Lake Okeechobee is big water. What is in it is bigger, and it is not staying at the bottom anymore. So, here's what I want to know from you. If you lived on either coast of Florida, would you trust the next round of water releases, or do you think this was the moment the system finally proved it cannot be saved? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them all. And if you want to see what happens when the next great American waterway gives up its buried secret, the story I am working on next is about a reservoir in the Midwest that just turned a color the EPA does not have a name for yet. Hit the subscribe button so you do not miss it, because what is sitting on the bottom of these lakes is not going to stay there much longer.